The freezing rain lashed against my skin, but I was already completely numb. Dozens of glowing red sniper lasers cut through the pitch-black graveyard, locking directly onto our chests. But Camilla wasn't looking at the mercenaries. She was looking at me. The absolute, unbreakable trust in her glacial blue eyes was fracturing into a million terrifying pieces. Standing safely under a black umbrella, the brother she had mourned for 10 years smiled. "Tell her, little bird," Julian's voice echoed through the storm. "Tell the Alpha Preen exactly who you really are. Nadia Sterling." The pale, eerie green light of the encrypted phone screen seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the freezing boat cabin. I watched the phone slip from Camilla's trembling fingers, her flawless, impenetrable Ice Queen armor entirely shattering under the weight of those 2 terrifying lines of text. "Beautiful explosion, little sister. I see you found grandfather's toy. Now, bring it to me." Before the heavy black device could hit the metal floorboards, my hand shot out, catching it in midair. I tossed it onto the digital navigation console and instantly turned my entire focus to the woman sitting beside me. Camilla was staring blankly at the dark bulkhead, her chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. The woman who had just stared down a syndicate executioner without blinking was now hyperventilating, entirely paralyzed by a ghost. "Camilla," I whispered, my voice cutting softly through the rhythmic, deafening roar of the massive twin engines. She didn't respond. Her glacial blue eyes were wide, dilated with a raw, agonizing mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. I shifted closer, closing the tiny gap between us on the cold metal bench. I reached out, sliding my hands under the heavy, dark trench coat draped over her shoulders and firmly gripped her waist. "Look at me," I commanded gently, my thumbs pressing soothing circles into the rigid muscles of her lower back. She flinched slightly at the contact, the traumatic shock locking her entirely in her own mind. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in until my chest was pressed flush against hers, sharing the desperately needed body heat in the freezing, damp cabin. I brought one hand up, my cold fingers gently but firmly cupping her jaw, forcing her to turn her head and meet my eyes. "Breathe, Camilla," I murmured, keeping my voice incredibly steady, offering her a completely unshakable anchor in the middle of her sudden psychological storm. "I am right here. You are safe. We are off the grid." For a long, agonizing second, she just stared into my eyes, her breath ghosting frantically across my lips. Then, slowly, the profound, terrified emptiness in her gaze began to recede, replaced by the crushing, devastating weight of reality. With a sudden, desperate sound that broke my heart, she completely collapsed forward. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her arms wrapping around my torso with a crushing, absolute ferocity, as if I were the only solid thing left in the universe. I held her tightly, burying my face in her damp, pale blonde hair, breathing in the scent of ocean salt and the faint, lingering trace of bergamot. We stayed like that for a long time, the military-grade interceptor tearing blindly through the open Atlantic on autopilot, carrying us further away from the burning wreckage of the oil rig. "They found his DNA in the wreckage," Camilla finally rasped against my skin, her voice muffled and violently trembling. "Julian's private jet went down in a horrific storm over the Alps 10 years ago. The crash site was entirely incinerated, but the forensic teams, my father's own private investigators, they confirmed the biological markers. He was dead, Nadia." I gently stroked the back of her head, my mind racing through the terrifying implications. "Your father spent the last decade hunting for a decentralized server network that he thought could save his empire," I said softly, my lips brushing against her temple. "But he didn't know the biometric sequence acted as a beacon." Camilla slowly pulled back, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but the lethal, calculating spark of her intellect was finally beginning to reignite. "Julian was grandfather's golden boy," she whispered, the horrifying puzzle pieces snapping into place. "He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely devoid of empathy. Grandfather didn't trust my father to inherit the Black Ledger. He trusted Julian. So Julian faked his death, I concluded, the freezing wind outside the cabin suddenly feeling significantly colder. He went completely off the grid, letting your father tear the Vance empire apart looking for a ghost. He knew he couldn't access the primary terminal without a massive global syndicate noticing the power surge, Camilla continued, her hands sliding down to grip mine, intertwining our fingers tightly. He needed a distraction. He needed someone else to trigger the catastrophic failsafe, to sever the physical servers and download the encrypted files into the cloud. She looked at the black phone resting in the console. He let me fight Nadia Sterling. He let me risk my life to secure the Gouda. And now that I have it in a portable digital format, he is coming to collect. We aren't going to let him take it, I stated firmly, squeezing her hands. Camilla looked at me, a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion softening the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. She reached up, her thumb gently tracing the line of my cheekbone, wiping away a streak of dark grease and seawater. I dragged you into a war with my father, Nadia, and we won, she murmured, her voice dropping into a register of pure, aching intimacy. Then I dragged you into a war with the European syndicate, and we survived. She leaned closer, the space between us charged with an electric, undeniable gravity. But Julian is a different kind of monster. He knows exactly how I think. He knows every weakness I have ever possessed. He doesn't know about me, I countered, refusing to look away from her intense gaze. He's been watching a chessboard for 10 years, Camilla, but I am not one of his pieces. I am the variable he couldn't predict. A slow, breathtaking smile finally broke through the terror on her face. It wasn't the wicked, arrogant smirk of the Alpha Queen. It was a soft, incredibly vulnerable smile of genuine, profound love. Without another word, she closed the distance and kissed me. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly tender. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the violent, desperate kiss we had shared in the dark tunnels just hours before. This kiss was a promise. It was the taste of survival, of shared trauma, and of an unbreakable absolute devotion that no trillion-dollar ledger could ever buy. Her cold lips parted against mine, a soft sigh escaping her throat as my hands tangled in her wet hair, pulling her closer until there was absolutely no space left between us. When we finally break apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other in the dim blue light of the navigation screens. Autopilot will bring us to a private inlet on the coast of Maine in exactly 2 hours, Camilla whispered, her eyes closed, simply absorbing the warmth of my skin. Elias secured a brutalist architectural retreat there for us 3 years ago. It is entirely, completely disconnected from any known Vance corporate holdings. Good, I murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her jawline. We need to get warm. And we need to figure out exactly where that text message came from. The next 2 hours passed in a heavy, exhausted silence. I sat sideways on the metal bench, my legs draped over Camilla's lap, my head resting heavily against her shoulder. She kept one arm wrapped securely around my waist, her hand idly tracing soothing, absent-minded patterns on my hip beneath the heavy coats. It was the most terrifying day of my life, yet wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous woman on Wall Street, I felt an inexplicable, absolute sense of safety. When the interceptor finally slowed, the thick morning fog had completely burned off, revealing a breathtaking, rugged coastline of jagged black rocks and towering, ancient pine trees. Hidden entirely within a deep, natural fissure in the cliffs was the safe house. It wasn't a sprawling glass mansion like the one we had left behind. It was a fortress. Built seamlessly into the dark granite, the structure was composed of heavy black steel and massive panes of reinforced, tinted glass. It looked like a villain's lair in a spy movie, designed perfectly to withstand a siege while remaining entirely invisible from the air or the sea. Camilla manually piloted the boat into a subterranean boathouse, the heavy steel doors sliding shut behind us, locking us safely in the quiet, echoing dark. The moment we stepped off the boat and entered the main living area, the automated climate control instantly kicked in, flooding the freezing room with glorious ambient heat. The interior was stark, minimalist, and incredibly luxurious. A massive ceiling-to-floor stone fireplace dominated the central room, surrounded by plush, dark velvet sofas and heavy fur throws. "Take those wet clothes off," Camilla ordered softly, her authoritative tone returning, though laced entirely with concern for me. "The master bathroom is down the hall to the left. The water is drawn directly from a geothermal spring. Go warm up." I looked at her, noting the slight tremor still present in her hands and the dark, exhausted circles under her beautiful blue eyes. "Only if you are coming with me," I replied quietly, refusing to let her isolate herself with the crushing weight of her brother's resurrection. Camilla stopped, turning to look at me in the worn, dim light of the safe house. Her gaze dropped to my lips and then back up to my eyes, a silent, burning heat slowly replacing the cold terror in her expression. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, stepping closer and reaching out to slowly unbutton the heavy, salt-stained coat I was wearing. The next hour was a quiet, profoundly intimate blur of hot water, the heavy scent of expensive cedarwood soap, and the overwhelming, desperate need to simply feel alive. There was no urgency, no frantic rush. We stood under the scalding spray of the massive slate shower, washing the ocean salt, the gunpowder, and the terror from each other's skin. Every touch was deliberate, every kiss a slow, reverent acknowledgement that we had survived the impossible. When Camilla gently tilted my head back, her hands sliding through my wet hair to massage my scalp, I closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, completely surrendering the last of my adrenaline to her care. Later, wrapped in thick, oversized cashmere sweaters we found in the master closet, we sat on the thick rug in front of the roaring stone fireplace. I sat between Camilla's legs, my back resting comfortably against her chest. She was gently and methodically towel-drying my dark, wavy hair, her fingers occasionally brushing against my neck, sending pleasant shivers down my spine. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the fortress. "Are you ready?" I finally asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence. I didn't need to specify what I was asking about. The encrypted black phone sat ominously on the glass coffee table a few feet away, a ticking time bomb waiting to be opened. Camilla's hands paused in my hair. She took a deep, steadying breath, her chest expanding against my back. "I have to be," she replied, her voice steady, the Alpha Queen finally re-establishing her absolute dominion over her own fear. She leaned forward, pressing a warm kiss to the crown of my head, and then shifted to the side, reaching for the heavy, matte black, secure laptop Elias had left on the desk near the window. She brought it to the rug, setting it down next to the phone. "Julian sent that message through a highly complex, multi-layered dark web routing protocol," Camilla explained, her fingers flying across the laptop keyboard with blinding speed as she tethered the phone to the computer. "He bounced the signal through proxy servers in Russia, Macau, and a satellite uplink over international waters to make it completely untraceable." "Can you break through it?" I asked, watching the complex lines of decrypting code reflecting in her intense blue eyes. "He taught me how to code when I was 12 years old," Camilla murmured, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "He taught me everything he knew. But he forgot that I spent the next 15 years learning everything he didn't." For 10 minutes, the only sound was the rapid, aggressive clicking of the keyboard and the crackling fire. I watched her work, completely mesmerized by her sheer, terrifying brilliance. She wasn't just a CEO. She was an apex predator in the digital realm, violently tearing through her dead brother's digital armor layer by agonizing layer. Suddenly, the screen flashed a brilliant, solid green. The frantic scrolling of text stopped instantly. "I had the source ping," Camilla whispered, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She hit the final execute key. The green screen dissolved, replaced by a highly detailed, high-resolution satellite map. A single, pulsing red coordinate appeared, locked dead center on the screen. I leaned forward, squinting at the geographical markers, trying to make sense of the location. It wasn't a super yacht in the Mediterranean. It wasn't a hidden penthouse in London or a bunker in the Swiss Alps. The coordinate was located deeply within a heavily forested private estate in upstate New York. "Nadia," Camilla breathed, her voice completely drained of blood, staring at the screen with absolute, horrifying realization. "Where is it?" I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "Whose estate is that?" Camilla slowly turned her head to look at me, the reflection of the red dot pulsing in her eyes like a drop of fresh blood. "It's the Vance family prized estate," she whispered, the words sounding like ashes in her mouth. "The signal is broadcasting directly from the underground mausoleum." The Ice Queen swallowed hard, her gaze shifting back to the screen. "Julian isn't hiding in the shadows, Nadia. He is sitting inside my grandfather's crypt." The words hung in the warm, cedar-scented air of the safe house like a physical weight, suffocating and entirely surreal. "The mausoleum," I repeated, the syllables tasting like ash on my tongue. "He is broadcasting a global, highly encrypted digital signal from inside a stone tomb?" Camilla didn't blink. She just kept staring at the pulsing red coordinate on the screen, her chest rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm as the initial shock began to crystallize into a terrifying, absolute rage. "It is psychological warfare, Nadia," she stated, her voice dropping into a register so cold and devoid of emotion it sent a shiver down my spine. "Julian never did anything without a meticulously calculated theatrical purpose. My grandfather's crypt is the most heavily fortified structure on the Vance estate. It is lined with 6 feet of lead and solid granite to prevent ground-penetrating radar." She slowly reached out, closing the heavy matte black laptop with a definitive, echoing snap. "He isn't just hiding there. He is claiming the throne. He is sitting on the bones of the man who built this empire, waiting for me to bring him the keys to the kingdom." I looked at her, watching the Alpha Queen completely rebuild her impenetrable armor, piece by piece in front of my eyes. But I knew the truth. I knew what lay beneath the bulletproof exterior. I reached out, my hands gently framing her face, forcing her to look away from the closed laptop and up at me. "He is trying to terrify you," I said softly, my thumbs tracing the sharp, beautiful lines of her cheekbones. "He wants you to feel like that 12-year-old girl he manipulated and controlled. He wants you to walk into that crypt completely paralyzed by his ghost." Camilla's glacial blue eyes softened for a fraction of a second, the raw, bleeding vulnerability bleeding through the ice. She leaned into my touch, her hands coming up to grip my wrists with a desperate, crushing intensity. "He taught me how to be a monster, Nadia," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her throat like shattered glass. "When we were children, he would systematically destroy anyone who even looked at me wrong. Not out of love, but out of ownership. I was his favorite possession, his masterpiece." She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her entire body. "If he has the Black Ledger, he won't just rule the financial world, he will burn it to the ground just to watch the ashes fall. He has absolutely no humanity left." I didn't offer her hollow platitudes. I didn't tell her everything was going to be fine. We were entirely past the point of comforting lies. Instead, I slid off the thick rug, straddling her lap and pulling her completely against my chest. She let out a soft, shuddering breath, her arms wrapping fiercely around my waist as she buried her face in the crook of my neck. "Then we don't let him take it," I murmured fiercely, my lips pressing against the damp, pale blonde hair at her temple. "You are not his possession, Camilla. You are the woman who brought down Richard Vance. You are the woman who outsmarted the European syndicate." I tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet my gaze. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting the profound, intoxicating gravity between us. "And you are not walking into that crypt alone." A beautiful, dangerous fire finally ignited in the depths of her icy gaze. She didn't say a word. She simply pulled me down, crashing her lips against mine with a sudden, overwhelming and absolute hunger. The kiss wasn't just a physical release, it was a desperate, burning vow of mutual survival. Her mouth was hot and demanding, completely devouring my breath, her tongue sliding against mine in a rhythm that made my entire body flush with a heavy, intoxicating heat. I tangled my hands in her hair, arching my back as her cold fingers slid under the hem of my oversized cashmere sweater, gripping my waist with a possessive, territorial strength that sent electricity shooting straight to my core. Every lingering touch, every soft gasp, was a defiant rejection of the death and terror waiting for us in New York. For 10 suspended, flawless minutes in the firelight, the global syndicate, the Black Ledger, and the resurrected brother entirely ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her skin, the heavy, dark scent of her perfume, and the absolute certainty that I would gladly tear the world apart to keep her safe. When we finally broke apart, our breathing was ragged, our foreheads resting against each other. "I love you," Camilla whispered, the words slipping out of her with a raw, unprotected honesty that made my heart physically ache. "You are my absolute gravity, Nadia. If he tries to touch you—" "He won't," I interrupted softly, pressing one last tenza kiss to her lips, "because we are going to kill the ghost." The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, lethal precision of the Alpha Queen. Camilla stood up, pulling me to my feet in one fluid motion. "Elias stocked a subterranean armory beneath this safe house," she stated, her voice hardening into impenetrable steel as she walked toward a hidden panel in the stone wall. "If Julian wants a family reunion, we are going to give him one." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in lethal preparation. The armory was a climate-controlled vault filled with the kind of tactical hardware that could overthrow a small government. The intimate, romantic warmth of the fireplace was replaced by the cold, heavy reality of Kevlar and gunmetal. We stripped off the soft cashmere sweaters, replacing them with sleek, form-fitting black tactical gear. There was an intense, unspoken intimacy in the way we helped each other gear up. Camilla stood behind me, her fingers brushing against my ribs as she securely fastened the heavy Velcro straps of my ballistic vest. I turned around, mirroring the action, my hands sliding over her shoulders to adjust her tactical harness. She looked entirely terrifying and utterly breathtaking, a dark angel of vengeance draped in matte black. She handed me 2 heavy, suppressed tactical sidearms and a sleek combat knife. "We take the stealth chopper," Camilla ordered, slamming a loaded magazine into her own weapon with a sharp, metallic crack. "It has a radar-absorbent coating and a silenced rotor system. We can be in upstate New York in under 90 minutes, completely undetected." I slid the weapons into my holsters, the familiar grounding weight of the steel steadying my racing heart. "Let's go, Hunt." The flight through the night was a silent, tense blur. The advanced military helicopter tore through the storm clouds, the heavy rain lashing violently against the reinforced glass of the cockpit. We sat side by side in the dark cabin, entirely engulfed in the suffocating silence of our own thoughts. The only point of light was the glowing digital navigation map, counting down the miles to the Vance family estate. I reached across the dark space between our seats, my hand finding Camilla's in the shadows. Her skin was completely ice-cold, her fingers gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. I didn't speak, I just intertwined my fingers with hers, applying a slow, steady pressure. She immediately loosened her death grip on the armrest, her hand wrapping desperately around mine, holding on to me like a lifeline in the middle of a hurricane. 2 minutes to target, Camilla's voice finally crackled over the secure comms in my headset, completely devoid of emotion. "I am setting the chopper down in the dense pine forest exactly 1 mile north of the cemetery." The helicopter descended rapidly, the trees violently whipping around us as the skids touched down on the wet, muddy earth with a heavy thud. We cut the engines, plunging ourselves into absolute, terrifying darkness. The rain was torrential, a heavy, freezing deluge that soaked through our tactical gear the moment we stepped out of the chopper. We moved through the dense black forest with practiced, silent, lethal efficiency, our night vision goggles painting the wet, decaying woods in a ghostly, luminescent green. After 20 grueling minutes of navigating the treacherous terrain, the tree line abruptly broke. Before us stood the Vance family estate. The massive Gothic mansion loomed in the distance like a haunted castle, its windows completely dark and lifeless, but we weren't heading for the house. Our target was the sprawling, ancient private cemetery, situated at the edge of the property, surrounded by a towering wrought iron fence shaped like jagged spears. The storm raged around us, the thunder masking the sound of our footsteps as we approached the heavy iron gates. "The mausoleum is at the exact center of the graveyard," Camilla whispered over the comms, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Keep your weapon drawn. Julian never travels without a shadow guard." We slipped through a narrow gap in the rusted iron fence, instantly enveloped by the oppressive, terrifying atmosphere of the graveyard. Dozens of towering marble angels and weathered stone obelisks stood like silent, judging sentinels in the driving rain. We moved flawlessly from cover to cover, sweeping our suppressed weapons across the dark, manicured lawns, checking every shadow. But the graveyard was completely, unnervingly empty. There were no tripwires, no thermal cameras, no elite mercenaries patrolling the perimeter. It was completely abandoned, exactly as it had been for decades. And then a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the center of the cemetery. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The Vance family mausoleum was a massive, terrifying structure built entirely of black granite, guarded by 2 colossal stone gargoyles. But it wasn't sealed. The massive 6-inch thick solid steel doors that required a heavy mechanical winch and a complex biometric cipher to open, were completely, violently wide open. A faint flickering orange light spilled out from the dark, dupping maw of the crypt, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet grass. "He's waiting for us," Camilla breathed, her voice trembling slightly over the comms, the sheer psychological weight of her brother's presence pressing down on her. "We stick to the plan," I replied fiercely, stepping in front of her, placing my body between her and the open crypt. "I go in first. You cover my blind spot." I didn't wait for her to argue. I raised my tactical sidearm, the red laser sight cutting through the heavy rain, and moved swiftly toward the glowing entrance of the mausoleum. The smell hit me the second I crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. It was the overpowering, suffocating smell of exotic lilies and burning beeswax, the exact floral arrangement used at Julian's funeral 10 years ago. I stepped fully into the crypt, my wet boots making absolutely no sound on the polished marble floor. The interior was massive, lined with dozens of stone sarcophagi belonging to generations of the Vance dynasty. But my eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the room. Dozens of tall, thick candles were burning brightly, surrounding a single, ornate, black marble tomb. The heavy stone lid of Julian Vance's coffin had been effortlessly shoved aside, shattering onto the floor in massive, jagged pieces. I kept my weapon raised, sweeping the flickering shadows, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Clear right," I whispered. "Clear left," Camilla echoed, stepping into the crypt behind me, her breathing ragged as she stared at her brother's empty grave. We moved slowly toward the center of the room, our weapons locked onto the empty sarcophagus. Sitting directly on the edge of the open tomb was a single, pristine white envelope, sealed with a heavy puddle of crimson wax, bearing the Vance family crest. Camilla slowly lowered her weapon, stepping past me like a woman entirely in a trance. She reached out with a trembling, gloved hand, picking up the envelope. She broke the wax seal, sliding out a piece of heavy, expensive parchment. I watched her eyes scan the elegant, handwritten script. Suddenly, all the color drained completely from her face. The parchment slipped from her fingers, fluttering silently to the cold marble floor. Before I could ask what it said, a massive, deafening, mechanical grinding noise echoed through the crypt. I spun around just in time to see the colossal, solid steel doors of the mausoleum violently slam shut, cutting off the sound of the storm and plunging us into the claustrophobic, flickering candlelight. The heavy internal deadbolts engaged with a series of terrifying, absolute thuds. We were completely locked inside the stone tomb. And then, a smooth, aristocratic, and utterly sociopathic voice echoed from a hidden speaker concealed deep within the shadows of the vaulted ceiling. "You always were so wonderfully predictable, Millie," Julian Vance purred, his voice dripping with dark, lethal amusement. "Welcome home, little sister. Now, let's talk about the ledger." The heavy, solid steel doors of the mausoleum ceiling shut sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous, flickering dark. The absolute finality of the heavy, internal deadbolts slamming into place vibrated through the marble floor, traveling straight up my spine and settling as a block of pure ice in my chest. Julian Vance's voice echoed through the ancient stone tomb. It wasn't the voice of a ghost or a distorted digital recording. It was perfectly clear, terrifyingly calm, and layered with the polished, arrogant cadence of a man who believed he was a god. "You always were so wonderfully predictable, Millie. Welcome home, little sister. Now, let's talk about the ledger." The heavy, solid steel doors of the mausoleum's ceiling shut sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous, flickering dark. The absolute finality of the heavy internal deadbolts slamming into place vibrated through the marble floor, traveling straight up my spine and settling as a block of pure ice in my chest. Julian Vance's voice echoed through the ancient stone tomb. It wasn't the voice of a ghost or a distorted digital recording. It was perfectly clear, terrifyingly calm, and layered with the polished, arrogant cadence of a man who believed he was a god. "You always were so wonderfully predictable, Millie. Welcome home, little sister. Now, let's talk about the ledger." I didn't wait for Camilla to recover from the paralyzing shock of hearing her dead brother's voice. I moved instantly, my combat boots completely silent on the marble, as I grabbed Camilla by the tactical harness of her vest and pulled her forcefully behind the heavy granite cover of a nearby sarcophagus. "Keep your weapon up," I hissed, my own suppressed sidearm sweeping the high, vaulted shadows of the ceiling, searching for the hidden cameras and speakers. "He's not in here with us. It's a closed-circuit broadcast." Camilla was shaking, her back pressed hard against the cold stone of the tomb. Her glacial blue eyes were fixed on the piece of heavy parchment that had fluttered to the floor near Julian's empty coffin. "The note," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual terrifying authority. "Nadia, the note." I kept my weapon raised, keeping my body securely positioned between her and the open center of the crypt. "What did it say, Camilla?" "It said, 'I took the air from your lungs 10 years ago. Let's see how long you can hold your breath today.'" Before I could even process the meaning of the words, a loud, mechanical hissing sound erupted from 4 massive, iron-grated vents set deep into the corners of the mausoleum floor. My ears popped violently as the atmospheric pressure in the sealed crypt instantly began to drop. "Halon gas?" I asked, my heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. If it was halon, we would be unconscious in under 60 seconds. "Worse," Camilla gasped, her hands flying to her throat as the terrifying reality of his trap set in. "It's a localized vacuum system. My grandfather installed it to prevent moisture and oxygen from decaying the historical documents stored in the lower vaults. Julian is siphoning the oxygen out of the room." Julian's dark, melodic chuckle echoed from the hidden speakers above us, completely filling the suffocating space. "A brilliant deduction, Millie. You have exactly 7 minutes before the oxygen deprivation causes permanent cognitive damage, and 10 minutes before your heart simply stop beating." I stared at the heavy steel doors, my mind calculating the explosive yield of the C4 charges Elias had packed in our tactical gear. "I can blow the doors," I told Camilla, reaching for the detonators on my belt. "No!" Camilla grabbed my wrist, her grip desperate and bruising. The doors are 6-inch solid tungsten steel. If you detonate C4 in a sealed, pressurized stone room, the concussive shockwave will instantly liquefy our internal organs before the doors even buckle. She's right, Nadia, Julian's voice purred, the sound entirely too intimate in the freezing, thinning air. And please, do not attempt to shoot the cameras. I want to watch my little sister make her final calculation. The hissing of the vents grew louder. I could already feel the terrifying effects of the dropping oxygen levels. The edges of my vision began to blur with a faint, creeping darkness. Every breath felt like inhaling thin, useless ice. Upload the decryption keys for the black ledger to the terminal hidden beneath my coffin, Julian commanded, his voice losing its playful edge, hardening into absolute, lethal demand. You give me the $1 trillion, Millie, and I will open the doors. You keep it, and you both die in the dark. Camilla slumped slightly against the granite tomb, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The invincible Alpha Queen was finally suffocating beneath the weight of her brother's psychological torture. I holstered my weapon. We couldn't shoot our way out of a vacuum. I turned to Camilla, dropping to my knees right in front of her. I grabbed both sides of her face, forcing her terrified, oxygen-starved eyes to lock onto mine. Listen to me, I commanded, my voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. He doesn't want to kill you. If he kills you, the cloud server holding the ledger permanently locks down. He needs you alive. He doesn't care, Camilla gasped, her cold fingers desperately clutching the lapels of my tactical vest. Julian would burn the world, just to prove he holds the match. I can't let you die here, Nadia. I'll give him the keys. She tried to push past me toward the center of the room, ready to surrender her grandfather's ultimate weapon, ready to hand $1 trillion of absolute blackmail leverage to a sociopath just to save my life. I didn't let her go. I pulled her completely against my chest, wrapping my arms fiercely around her back and crushing her to my body. I am not letting you surrender to a ghost, I murmured against her ear, the lack of oxygen making my head spin dangerously. I pulled back just enough to look at her lips. In the flickering, dying light of the candles, which were rapidly extinguishing as the oxygen was sucked from the room, she looked devastatingly beautiful. I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, frantic kiss of two people saying goodbye. It was a fierce, commanding, deeply intimate transfer of absolute willpower. I breathed the last of the clean air from my lungs directly into hers, my tongue sliding against hers in a slow, possessive rhythm that completely grounded her in the physical reality of my touch, pulling her out of the traumatic spiral of her past. Her hands tangled weakly in my dark hair, a soft, heartbreaking whimper escaping her throat as she completely melted into the kiss, drawing strength from the undeniable, burning connection between us. When I finally pulled back, black spots were dancing violently in my vision, but the panic in Camilla's eyes was entirely gone. The Ice Queen was back, and she was furious. She turned her head, her glacial blue eyes locking onto the tiny, blinking red light of the hidden camera lens tucked behind the stone wing of a gargoyle above us. You always were a brilliant architect, Julian, Camilla rasped, her voice weak but dripping with absolute, venomous defiance. But you are a terrible chess player. She leaned heavily against my shoulder, her hand reaching into one of the tactical pouches on her vest. She didn't pull out a phone or a decryption drive. She pulled out a small, heavy black metallic cylinder with a biometric thumb pad on the top. Do you know what this is, brother? Camilla asked, holding the device up toward the camera lens. Silence echoed from the speakers. It's a localized, military-grade dead man switch, Camilla explained, a wicked, breathtaking smirk curving her lips despite her pale, suffocating state. It is synced directly to my heart rate via the biometric sensors in my tactical harness. My eyes widened as I looked at the device. I knew exactly what she had done. "If my heart stops beating," Camilla whispered, her voice carrying the absolute, terrifying authority of the Vance Empire. "This switch broadcasts a quantum-encrypted kill signal to the cloud server holding the Black Ledger." She pressed her thumb against the pad. The cylinder pulsed with a bright, aggressive red light, locking the sequence. "If I suffocate in this crypt, the ledger permanently purges. Every file, every bank account, every piece of leverage you need to conquer the syndicate turns to digital ash." The hissing of the vents suddenly seemed deafening in the silence that followed. Camilla stared into the camera, her arm wrapped tightly around my waist, leaning her entire body weight against me as the oxygen levels plummeted to a critical threshold. "So, Julian," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as the darkness began to claim her. "Let's see how long you can hold your breath." For 10 agonizing, terrifying seconds, absolutely nothing happened. My lungs were screaming, my muscles burning with lactic acid. I tightened my grip on Camilla, burying my face in her neck, fully prepared to die in the dark with the woman I loved. Then, the hissing abruptly stopped. A heavy, electronic chime echoed through the crypt. The colossal steel doors groaned violently, the deadbolts retracting with a series of massive, echoing thuds. The doors swung open, and the freezing, violent wind of the thunderstorm instantly blasted into the mausoleum, carrying a massive, beautiful wave of fresh, breathable air. I gasped violently, my lungs burning as the oxygen flooded my system. Camilla slumped against me, coughing harshly as she dragged the freezing rain and air into her chest. Julian's voice crackled over the speaker one last time, completely devoid of amusement. "Checkmate, little sister. Come out and claim your prize." I didn't hesitate. I threw Camilla's arm over my shoulder, taking most of her weight as we stumbled out of the suffocating darkness of the tomb and into the blinding, freezing deluge of the graveyard storm. We staggered into the center of the manicured lawn, the torrential rain instantly soaking us to the bone. I raised my tactical sidearm, blinking rapidly to clear the water from my eyes as I swept the perimeter. We were not alone. Emerging from the pitch-black shadows of the ancient obelisks and towering stone angels were dozens of elite, heavily armed mercenaries. They moved with absolute, terrifying silence, the crimson beams of their laser sights cutting through the heavy rain and locking directly onto our chests. But they didn't fire. They simply formed a massive, impenetrable perimeter around us. Then, the crowd of mercenaries slowly parted. Walking down the central gravel path of the cemetery, entirely unbothered by the torrential rain, was a man holding a large, elegant black umbrella. He was wearing an immaculate, tailored dark suit. He had the same pale, aristocratic features as Camilla, the same sharp jawline, and the same terrifyingly intelligent, calculating eyes. Julian Vance. 10 years of hiding in the shadows hadn't aged him. It had simply crystallized him into something entirely cold and absolute. Camilla stood up straight, shrugging my arm off her shoulder. She squared her stance, her hands resting near the weapons at her hips, staring at the ghost of her childhood tormentor with absolute burning hatred. "You wanted my attention, Julian," Camilla yelled over the deafening crash of thunder. "You have it. Call off your dogs and let's finish this." Julian stopped 10 feet away from us. He didn't look angry about the dead man's switch. He looked entirely, deeply fascinated. But he wasn't looking at Camilla. His dark, piercing eyes completely bypassed his sister and locked directly onto me. A slow, chilling smile spread across his aristocratic face. "I didn't orchestrate this entire theatrical reunion just to get the ledger, Millie," Julian said smoothly, his voice cutting effortlessly through the sound of the storm. He tilted the black umbrella back slightly. the lightning illuminating the absolute sociopathic triumph in his eyes. The biometric lock on grandfather's ledger requires a dual signature. It requires Vance blood, and it requires the blood of the one family he despised more than his own. My heart stopped completely. The freezing rain felt like ice water in my veins. Camilla frowned, stepping protectively in front of me, her hand gripping the hilt of her combat knife. "What are you talking about, Julian?" Julian laughed, a dark, hollow sound that was instantly swallowed by the storm. "Oh, Millie," he mocked softly, shaking his head. "You are the most brilliant woman on Wall Street, and you let a viper sleep in your bed without ever checking its fangs." He pointed a gloved finger directly at me. "Tell her, little bird," Julian commanded, his eyes gleaming with lethal amusement. "Tell the Alpha Queen exactly who you really are. Tell her why Nadia Sterling tried so desperately to shoot you on that oil rug." Camilla slowly turned her head, looking at me. The absolute trust in her blue eyes was suddenly fractured by a terrifying, creeping sliver of doubt. "Nadia?" Camilla whispered, the rain streaming down her pale face. I stood completely frozen, staring at the man under the umbrella, the horrifying, buried truth of my past violently tearing its way to the surface. "Hello, Nadia Sterling," Julian Vance announced to the graveyard, the words echoing like a death knell in the storm. "Victoria's discarded daughter. Welcome to the family business." Nadia Sterling? That plot twist just completely shattered everything. I am still trying to process that massive cliffhanger. If you are as stunned as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now to see how Camilla reacts, and I want to see how far this story is reaching. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and I will see you in episode 7.